Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Revolution 250 Advisory Group. We are a consortium of 70 plus organizations in Massachusetts looking at ways to commemorate the beginnings of American independence. And our guest today is Maurice Barboza. Maurice Barboza is I'll let you tell us more about who you are, Maurice. You grew up in Plainville, Connecticut. Got a law degree at Rutgers, and now for 40 years have been working on the National Mall Liberty Fund that is building a monument on the National Mall to the African American patriots who served in the Revolution.
Yes, I didn't set out to build a monument or to battle for, 40 years with the Daughters of the American Revolution. I just thought there was a picture on my grandmother's living room wall of a man dressed in a Civil War uniform. And all I knew was his last name and that it was my grandmother's grandfather. And that was about it. We knew they were from Maine. And so after my grandmother's death in 1975, my mother asked one of my aunts if I could take that picture, and she agreed and gave it to me. And I continued to think about it. Then in 1978, after having seen Roots and having been through the bicentennial,
Yes.
I decided to go to the archives and figure out who this person was. And to my surprise, I found his war records. And it was easy because they were in folders. They gave me 3 at a time. I looked through the first one. I knew it wasn't my ancestor. And when I looked through the next one, I saw all these familiar names, names that my aunts and uncles had been named, and other information that, of course, my great-grandfather's name as the son of this soldier. And so that's what got me going. And I traveled through museums, libraries, cemeteries, beginning in Maine, which was Massachusetts at the time.
Right. Yeah.
Union, Maine. And then I traveled through museums in Massachusetts, bookstores, and I discovered the family dating back to 1630 and the arrival of the John and Mary at Watertown in Massachusetts. And the family just burgeoned. And moved to Rentham and Watertown and other places. So it was just such an enjoyable trip.
Oh, yeah, it is. It's really a captivating thing, exploring these different generations. Now, who was this individual whose picture captivated you as a boy? Who was the individual whose picture you saw?
Oh, the photograph is of my great-great-grandfather, John Curtis Gay, who enlisted in the Civil War at the age of 38, Union Army. And he was sent to, eventually he made his way from January when he enlisted to June 1st or 3rd. He found himself at a very bad place, the Battle of Cold Harbor. He was wounded. His leg was amputated. He was taken to a military hospital in New York from Virginia. Cold Harbor is just outside of Richmond. And then eventually he was taken to a hospital in Augusta, Maine, where he died on Christmas Day of 1864. So his military service was just really a matter of 4 or 5 months. And I like to think that the Emancipation Proclamation had something to do with his decision to join. I saw nothing in these records that would have suggested any of his ancestors had anything to do with the institution of slavery or subjugating other people. That was a good thing to know.
Yeah. So, and then did you find ancestors in the Revolutionary War?
Yes. I guess it was my trip to Maine and to Union, Maine, where, and I just love this memory. I'd called ahead of time and they said, "Oh, sure, come down. We'll make the records available for this particular family." And when I walked into the small town hall, I saw that there was an enormous walk-in safe with huge volumes stacked up against all the three walls that were visible to me. And so I explained who I was, and they remembered the phone call. And they said, "Oh, come on in and just walk in. The records beginning with G are on this side." And I started taking these large volumes. They seemed to be like 2 feet by 3 feet or whatever, with this remarkable handwriting. I can't recall how far I got back. I believe it was to the grandfather of John Curtis Gay, the Civil War soldier. I thought at that moment that maybe there was a possibility that one of his ancestors had served in the Revolutionary War. There were 2 previous generations in that town of Gays after they had left Massachusetts. And I decided to go to the archives in Augusta. And I found another half of the family, which I thought may have had a connection. It wasn't until I got back to Washington that I confirmed by finding a very detailed genealogy, which I discovered at the Daughters of the American Revolution Library. And it contained the name of my great grandfather. Every generation, 8 or 9 generations going back to John Gay, who arrived on the John and Mary and eventually settled in Dedham and was active in some of the town hall meetings that I was discussing with Jonathan Lane.
Interesting. And your aunt, Lena Ferguson, you became a member of the Sons of the American Revolution and then pushed for her to join the DAR. And then that's a story in and of itself, of her attempt to join the DAR. And she did ultimately. And I wonder, actually, we can talk about that, but also I really want to know what sparked you then to the idea of a monument on the National Mall to the Black soldiers and others at the time of the Revolution.
Well, I was welcomed into the Sons of the American Revolution. The book collector, Charles Blockson, who donated 50,000 volumes to Temple University. It's now somewhere about 500,000 volumes and the roles of African Americans in history. And I met him one day, and I told him, what I'd done, just as I've explained to you. And he said, "You ought to join the Sons of the American Revolution." I'd never heard of the Sons of the American Revolution. So I made a phone call to the office in Washington, and they explained to me what I needed to do. You needed, 2 members to sign your application papers, and they gave me the papers, and I filled them out. And one Saturday morning, I called the 2 men, and they said, "Okay, come by, and we'll talk to you a little bit." And they did, and they signed my papers, and I submitted them the next Monday. And within 2 months, I heard back that I had been accepted and that they wanted me to come to a formal dinner that they were having so they could present my certificate. So it was a wonderful experience. I liked the association with these guys. And then I was showing the photographs, the other findings of my trips to Massachusetts and Maine to my aunts, 3 of my aunts, including Lena Ferguson. And I said to them, "Would you want to join the Daughters of the American Revolution? Because the requirements are the same." And Lena said that, "Maurice, I'll do it, but it's not going to be easy." And she, more than any of the other aunts and uncles, well, I don't know whether I should say that, but she understood racism, and she had come to Washington in 1950. And so she knew what it was like to sit on the back of the bus, in restaurants, and she knew all about the DAR. And in fact, she told me that she and my grandparents and others in the family had watched Marian Anderson's concert. So she immediately wrote the DNR and asked for information and explained that I was a member of the Sons of the American Revolution. And a few days later, she called me and said, "I have this letter from the registrar for," or I think she was a higher level. I'm not quite sure who's the top person in Washington. And it was a recitation of the bylaws. You need to have 2 sponsors. You need to do this. So it was a standoffish letter that suggested to Lena that they really don't want me. And so that was the beginning of this whole thing. And she went to meetings, eventually found a sponsor. In 1983, there was a story in the Post about it, that the DAR didn't want her in a local chapter, like in Washington. At the same time, the DAR was pocketing $800 to $1 million a year in tax breaks from the District of Columbia. There were no Black members, and people were not happy about it. So I called the Washington Post several times. Finally, I hit pay dirt, and they said, "Come on in, we'll talk about it." And they did interviews with the DAR President General, and she said some remarkable things like, "You held a dinner party, well, and somebody came and they weren't invited, what would you do?" And what she was expressing was a generations long effort to prevent Black people from joining. So they had various rules. The chapters could, blackball a member if they didn't like them for various reasons. And that's how it started. And the memorial came out of that. I said to myself, well, I'm sure there were a handful of Blacks who served in the Revolutionary War. That's how I discovered Dr. Corral's book. And I thought, right, God, he estimates that there were 5,000 and they ought to be on. And that's how that came.
It's an amazing number. And then you found that a big percentage were from Massachusetts and New England. So I'm wondering, and you've broken this. I mean, you see the monument as more than simply a piece of marble. It's really an educational tool. And you've done tremendous research into the people behind the monument and the stories behind them and the towns they came from.
Yes, that after the front page story hit the Washington Post, it created a firestorm, and the DAR was with the loss of its tax exemption. A friend of mine called and said that she worked with the Washington Lawyers Committee and that they were interested in talking to my aunt. We did with them, and they decided that they would ask the law firm Hogan Hartson to take this on as a case. And Lena did not want to sue them, so we came up with ideas that would cause them to, maybe over a period of time, to change. And one of them was, of course, to bar discrimination in membership and to explain to prospective members that they could join the organization if they had an ancestor, regardless of their color in the Revolutionary War. But the real key thing was the requirement that they research and publish a document that contained the names of every African American who served in the Revolutionary War, patriots and soldiers, people who would have made their descendants eligible to join the organization. Once that several steps were published, there were a series of pamphlets that were incomplete and did not, in our opinion, meet the requirements. They did a compendium in 2001 that clearly there were about 2,000 soldiers. I did an op-ed in the New York Times with the great historian Gary Nash, and explained that they were using criteria that would automatically limit the number of African Americans who were identified. And the year later, they asked Gary Nash to conduct a seminar at Constitution at our headquarters, and he brought in a number of historians, and they went through my explanations of the reasons why these criteria were improper and limited. That is, the only people they would include were Black rather Negro, mulatto, and the term black. So it left out all the mixed race people who might have been described as yellow, copper, bronze, brown. And there were ways to verify that these people were, in fact of African descent. I went to Congresswoman Nancy Johnson from Connecticut and got a lot of support. In fact, Connecticut and Massachusetts were of great help in this legislation through Congress. But President Reagan signed a bill that was introduced to honor the role of African Americans. That was at the same time the Post article hit the paper.
Right.
And so gave us a little bit of, quite a bit of leverage at the time. And then the idea came at the end of 1984 when people, after the settlement had been signed, when people were, reporters rather, were still calling Lena and me. And I decided that we needed to build a monument. And that's how that came about.
Right. It's fascinating. We're talking with Maurice Barboza, who is the founder and CEO of the National Liberty Memorial, the National Liberty Fund in the District of Columbia, building a monument to the African Americans who served in the Revolutionary War. And as I said, you've come up with a tremendous database of people and places. So I'm just looking at it and seeing that there were 115 actually from what is now the city of Boston, 93 from the town of Boston, others from Charlestown, Roxbury, Dorchester. And you've done similar things in other states like North Carolina and South. Have you done South Carolina?
Yes.
Yeah. And one of the really interesting things is tracking then the stories of these individuals, both at the time and afterward. I know in the New Jersey site, there is a fellow named Cesar who lives to be 106. I mean, the story itself is interesting, and his service in the revolution is relatively short, but you get the stories of these extraordinary stories of people that you've been uncovering in this project.
Yes, this person is not from Massachusetts, but his story is so remarkable. It just, excuse me, his name is James Robinson. And I became aware of him. I believe he's mentioned in Dr. Coral's book. And I knew he'd served in the Revolution. He also served in the War of 1812. And how he got there is remarkable. He was born in Maryland. He went and served in the Revolutionary War with his master. He served the full 8 years of the war. And in fact, when his master's name was Scales, he died during the war. He volunteered to take all of his possessions in a wagon from Pennsylvania back to the eastern shore of Maryland. So he was a guy who was who understood, who felt the sense of duty. So the promise to free him was reneged on, and he was instead sent deeper into the South, into slavery, to New Orleans and then to Mississippi, and he was stripped of his medals. He was at Yorktown and he was decorated by Lafayette, and he one day, none other than Andrew Jackson comes by and is recruiting blacks just as they did during the Revolutionary War. We're going to give you your freedom if you join up and serve in this war. So he said he was reluctant to do it because he'd been there before, but he did, and he served for 1 or 2 years in the War of 1812, and he remained a slave. He came back, and Jackson, we're not gonna free you. You'll have to ask your masters to do that. So he was never paid. He never received a pension. And then after the war, it was about, I guess, Buchanan and whatever. He somehow made his way to Washington, and he pleaded with Buchanan for help getting a pension. He was refused. Somehow he made it to Detroit. And by now, the man is well into his 70s.
Mm-hmm.
He lived to be 115 years old, as per your
Wow.
example, and he became a preacher.
Mm-hmm.
A citizen of Michigan,
Mm-hmm.
and buried, and he has a headstone and a wonderful member of the Michigan Sons of the American Revolution, um, Elijah Elijah Shattuck, had honored him by
Wow.
putting an SAR plaque and ceremony, and it was great. It was in the various newspapers, the Washington Post and the Baltimore
Mm-hmm.
paper.
Mm-hmm.
And so he eventually, many generations later, was recognized for his service, his patriotism. I don't know whether you call it patriotism or not. He certainly had an interest, just as all these others had an interest in winning their freedom. And so, as Quarles said, they were going to go to wherever they thought they could get the best deal. And
Mm-hmm.
apparently, his deal was not with the side of the Americans, although he fulfilled.
Well, that's where he thought it was, and then a lot of others served on the other side in the revolution, seeing that would be the more advantageous deal for them. It's but then there are others who do serve. And again, we're always trying to understand what motivated people, why if free men, or in some cases enslaved men who didn't have to, did serve. I mean, that's one of the big questions we have, is what motivated these people, and what do you see as the motivation for people of any kind to serve?
I think it's human nature to want to be free. I don't think you want to hitch your star to a dictator, a person, or a society that's going to tell you what to do, where you can eat, where you can work, or whether you can work, or whether you receive pay or pensions or whatever. And they were intelligent people. They're not going to be any different than African Americans of today. I mean, and you think of the tragedy of losing all that brain power, and but the motivation was personal freedom and to secure freedom for subsequent generations. And this was the generation that created the infrastructure for the civil rights movement. There would not be a civil rights movement. There would not be, Prince Hall Masons or churches and self-help groups and the whole host of institutions that were created by these people and inspired by them and passed on. And this desire to be free and to be fully citizens of the United States of America, that was passed on. And it just continued from one generation to the other. And it was something that was embedded in this culture, and that these people could serve in subsequent wars, like James Robinson serving in the War of 1812, and others serving, and their descendants serving in the Civil War, and World War I, and World War II. And it seemed not to deter them. And so that makes this the most remarkable story. This is the most remarkable story in American history, period. These were the people who made the words that were written by those eloquent men in Philadelphia. They made it real, just as automobiles were perfected, not because of the design of Mr. Benz or Mr. Ford, but because there were people who were willing to drive these things and test them out and demonstrate where they needed to be tweaked, and look at what we have now. Cars can go, 200, 300, 400 miles an hour. So this is the same thing with the democracy. We're still learning, and hopefully we've learned enough to be able to survive as such between now and the semi-quincentennial and
tricentennial. So we're talking with Maurice Barboza, who is the founder and chief executive officer of the Liberty National Memorial. So where is the memorial going to be?
Yes. Um, we looked at 42 sites in Washington, and the day that we took a tour with the National Park Service representative, he took us to a spot that I thought this couldn't be real. It's a little hidden now because it's a parking lot on the mall. It's probably the only parking lot on the mall.
Wow.
Between the Washington Monument, and it's hidden behind shrubbery and trees and everything else. And he said, this is the site, and it's on the mall. It's available. And I thought, this is the one. We looked at all the others, and after submitting site studies and discussions with various agencies, we were able to narrow it down to 2 sites. The site is directly across from the Washington Monument. It's on 14th Street and Independence Avenue. And if you're coming in from Virginia, this is the busiest route coming into and out of Washington. You pass the Pentagon, you cross over what was the trail of Rochambeau heading south. And you cross the Rochambeau Bridge, or better known as the 14th Street Bridge. And when you approach Independence Avenue, just to the right, as you're heading in toward downtown Washington and the City Hall, you pass this site that sort of juts out into the street. And there is a place that we want to place the memorial. And with the sufficient support to do so, we need to do an environmental assessment and some preliminary designs in order to secure the site. So it went from 42 sites to 2 sites, and this is the favorite site of the foundation and the preferred site also. We were told by various commissions and agencies which thought that this would indeed tell the story of African Americans in the Revolutionary War by its relationship with the Washington Monument, the African American History Museum, the Holocaust Museum, and other remarkable museums nearby on the mall. And it's about 2.2 miles from the Pentagon, and then another 2 miles continuing on 14th Street. You come to U Street, an area that was a haven for African Americans during Jim Crow segregation. So, if you couldn't stay at the Willard Hotel, you went to U Street and you had your meal, you enjoyed entertainment, and you could function as a human being.
Wow. So that's fascinating. And so how far along are we in the process of making sure it is up, available for the next generations to enjoy?
We need to raise some serious money. First off, to be able to do the things that I explained, the environmental assessment, and that's going to cost us funding. And I think I can be optimistic that even though we still have, there's 3 years remaining on the authorization, this couldn't be a better time to talk about the role of a forgotten people in the Revolutionary War. It's like once in a generation appearance of an eclipse.
Right.
Everything comes together at this point. We have your 77 organizations. We have organizations that were set up in their charters, like the Sons and the Daughters of the American Revolution, to honor people who served in the Revolutionary War. And if you're not going to honor them at this time, as we await the semi-quincentennial, then there must be something wrong then with the thinking that's going on, because this is new history. It's not history in the last 40 years. Ira Berlin and other great historians undertaken these efforts to honor these people, and they've added great scholarship, books, and other ways of depicting these people. Just made it incumbent on us to get this done.
Right. So this is our task now. The generation of Benjamin Quarles, Gary Nash advanced this story in the scholarly field that is identifying and reshaping the story. And now ours is getting the monument so the next generation can start there and not have, this won't be a hidden history. So it will be something that is part of the narrative. So what's the best way if people wanted to support this? What would you suggest someone who's listening might do if they wanted to help move this along?
Yeah, one of the things that we'd like to do is we'd like these communities, as you explained so well, who now know that they were a community where African Americans had served from in the Revolutionary War. And we received, I think it was something like 14 resolutions from communities and counties and cities in Massachusetts and, Virginia and 7 or 8 other states as well. And we'd like to translate this into a realization that they have a stake in seeing this built, and that it'll be on the National Mall, and it will define not only American history, but it'll define the history of these localities and their remarkable involvement. So we want them to tell their legislators, pass appropriations and put some money into this and make this a central theme of the semi-quincentennial. Because if it's not, future generations and leaders, if we still care about these things, 5 or 10 years from now, are going to be wondering, well, gee, we went through the centennial, 1876, 1976. We saw tall ships, and we saw very little, if anything, that promoted new history and forgotten history. I think it's so. I'm excited by the fact that we're in this situation at this point.
This is a very exciting place to be. And let me just say, I focused on the folks from around Boston who were part of this, but then there were 23 from Andover and 15 from Concord, 25 from the town of Dartmouth, 12 from Falmouth, which is probably Portland up in Maine, 9 from Grafton, 23 from Lancaster, 18 from Newbury, 15 from Marblehead, 10 from Northampton. That is a surprising number from places like Taunton, Swansea, who are part of this, communities then and now. So you're right. And then on your website, you also have in Connecticut and in North Carolina, South Carolina, actually where individuals were from in these towns. And it does make us, Jonathan's reminded me of Bridgewater. We don't want to forget Bridgewater.
Yes.
So yes, and Bridgewater, did I say 40 people from Bridgewater, which is an amazing number. And you think about areas where maybe historians don't realize the presence of the people of color in these communities then, and their importance in the community, so that they're part of the militia in the community. And then when the call comes on April of 1775, they're there. We know about some individuals like Peter Salem and Salem Poor. And I think one of the real things that this work has done is highlight how many individuals there were. It's not just the few whose names we have been taught over the last 40 years, but in virtually every community, you're going to find people of color, free or enslaved, and many in Massachusetts actually agitating for the end of slavery. And Jonathan's reminding us of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment that's now getting a lot of attention. That was 2 companies of free or enslaved or indigenous people who served at the Battle of Rhode Island and in other places. So you're right. This is a story. It's essential that part of our legacy be making sure the next generations know about this history, so they're not starting off where you and your Aunt Lena did and just trying to learn the story.
That's perfect. Yes.
So we've been talking with Maurice Barboza, who is from the National Liberty Memorial, and you can tell your legislators to support this. Their website, libertyfunddc.com, has more information on the the bills that are pending and other ways that we can all support this work and advance this work you're in. So thank you so much, Maurice, for taking this on.
Thank you so much, Bob. It was a pleasure. I enjoyed it.
And yeah, and then let us know how we can continue helping and making
I will,
this
absolutely.
good. Very good. So thank you. And so thank you. Tremendous work, the National Liberty Memorial, and tremendous work. You can find out a lot about the history of the revolution by going onto your website and exploring it, which I've been able to do. And so thank you for doing this. And
Thank you.
Let me also thank our producer, Jonathan Lane, who's been reminding me of things during the show. And if you have a topic you want to raise, or if you want to talk to Jonathan, Lane at revolution250.org. And also I want to thank our listeners around the country, actually around the world, who tune in regularly. And every week I thank folks in different communities. If you're in one of these places, send Jonathan Lane an email at jlane@revolution250.org. He'll send you one of our posters or lapel pins. And this week, Midlothian, Virginia, Concord, Massachusetts, Mishawaka, Indiana, San Juan Capistrano in California. As spring comes, inevitably we think about the swallows returning to Capistrano, and Ashford in County Wicklow in Ireland, and all places between and beyond. Thanks for joining us. And now Jonathan will pipe us out on the road to Boston.